Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Karen Butter, and I'm president of the Friends of the Alameda Free Library. We're going to get started in just a minute, but I wanted to let everyone join. In the meantime, welcome, and we're so glad that you're joining us this evening for the presentation. Tonight, we are joined by author Lizzie Johnson, whose recount of the campfire is alarming and a wake-up call for all Californians. Her book is an in-depth account of the 2018 campfire, depicting human drama and government missteps. I will talk with Ms. Johnson about the book, and I invite viewers to submit your questions and comments. Before we get started, I want to review a few technical details. This is a live webinar. The audio for the audience is muted and the video is turned off, so you will only see the speaker and her and me. We will record this event for those who want to view it later. Please use the chat to introduce yourselves, to ask questions, and to send comments. We love to hear where you're located, and please let us know through the chat. And please be respectful in your comments. Before I turn it over to tonight's author, I want to talk briefly about the Friends of the Alameda Free Library. We are a nonprofit organization that raises funds and advocates for an outstanding public library in Alameda. Through Friends at Home, we are thrilled to connect with you and to share common experiences. A special thanks to our supporters for their ongoing donations so that we can continue to honor our commitment to the library and to support future Friends at Home events. We ask that you consider a donation to the Friends in any amount that is comfortable for you via our website at alamedafriends.com or use the direct link listed in the chat. Now on to our program. We are excited to be joined by author Lizzie Johnson, formerly journalist at the San Francisco Chronicle. Her book, Paradise, is a deeply moving, detailed account of the campfire that has been called the deadliest and most destructive wildfire in California's history, and the most expensive natural disaster in the world in 2018 in terms of insured losses. As someone noted, this is a book which all in California and perhaps the Western US and all wildfire-prone areas worldwide should read. It helps us to understand the confluence of reasons that caused the tragedy of Paradise to occur. And I would like to think that we are better learning how to fight wildfires, but even in recent fires, we see missteps and lack of preparedness by government, industry, and citizens. Now, let me ask Lizzie to join the discussion. So Lizzie, welcome. We're so glad you're this evening.
Thank you for having me, Karen.
So could you tell us a little bit about your background?
Yeah, so I grew up in the Midwest in Nebraska and went to the University of Missouri for college. After I got out of school, I moved out to California and started working for the San Francisco Chronicle. And I covered City Hall for a while, realized that I hated politics. So that's when I started getting into fire coverage.
And how did you become interested in writing about Paradise?
Yeah, so I had been covering fires for a few years when the campfire happened. And so, part of doing that job is you just have to be really on the ball. And when a fire breaks out, you have to go to where that fire is. So on the morning of November 8th, 2018, I got this call from my editor and he was like, "Hey, I hear there's this fire happening near a town called Paradise. Can you go?" And so it felt like less of a choice and more like that's just naturally what I did for my job. And so I drove to Butte County and into that giant bank of smoke, not really knowing what to expect and having no idea that this is what it would turn into, both it being the biggest fire and it ended up being a book that I wrote.
And how long did you spend in Paradise writing the book?
I was in Paradise for the better part of 2 years. There was a while where I spent more time in Paradise than I did in my own home. I ended up moving in with a local family up there. And so, I would go spend a week in Paradise and then go home for a week. in San Francisco and sort of go back and forth. So I was there for, all of the big milestones, when people were allowed to go back to their homes and see them for the first time, only to realize there really wasn't anything left to find, to, the first high school graduation, which was up at the school, which had been damaged. And somehow the superintendent had pulled it off to make that happen, to, the 1-year anniversary. And then the first time there were actually homes being built and not just the rubble being taken away, to the 2-year anniversary. And that sense that, things were a lot slower than people expected. So I spent a lot of time in Paradise, to the point where it just felt very familiar to me and almost like a second home.
And did the whole time you were in Paradise, you were reporting on the fire?
Right. So luckily it was pretty seamless in that so much of what I was doing for the San Francisco Chronicle was also what I was doing for the book. So I was able to do both at the same time. So, for example, on the day that CAL FIRE issued its investigative report proving that it was PG&E who had started the campfire, I was already in Paradise to work on the book. And so I was one of the few, if not only, reporters outside of the town who was there and was able to write a story really quickly on, what people thought of that and what it meant for them, knowing that the fire could have been prevented.
And when did you know you were going to write a book?
I always say it kind of snuck up on me. I don't know if there was ever an exact moment of knowing, and it was more so just that sense of, okay, well, someone needs to write a book and I care so much that I think that person should be me. And then it's just also the accumulation of so much information, right? Where I had interviewed so many people and was still so curious and wanted to know more. And I knew that if I dared turn in a story to my newspaper editor with all of those interviews, he'd be like, this is like 200 inches. It's not going to fit in the paper. And so at that point, it was like, okay, well, maybe the home for this is in a book. And I think there's something so powerful in trying to memorialize a place and its people, and to feel like your job as a journalist has more standing power and can withstand the test of time, right? Like I started to care so much that I wanted it to exist in a book so people could pick it up for years to come.
Mm-hmm. And you did a lot of interviewing of people in Paradise. And how did you gain their confidence, and how were you able to interview them?
I think it's just a matter of being there and staying. I had noticed over the years that whenever a big disaster like a fire would happen, all of these journalists would parachute in and be there for the like big, flashy, dramatic moments. So over and over, you would see those scenes play out of people evacuating through flames and packing just a few things, or digging through the ashes of their home to find a china plate or a wedding ring. And after that, the coverage would sort of drop off, and there was no sensitivity to the things that came afterwards. So just being there again and again, the local officials got to know me. They knew that I cared and was sticking around, and started to confide in me and tell me, this is why we love this place, and this is why it matters and why people should care.
And were you ever endangered by the fire?
I think that when you're covering events like this, there's always, sorry, my dog has some opinions about danger. Yeah, like it is very scary to drive into a fire like that, because you really don't know what's waiting for you on the other side. You see trees falling down and power lines, and I think in the back of your head, you always know that it's a hypothetical. It's something that could be dangerous, but you're so fixated on the job at hand that you sort of have to push that off to the sidelines and just focus on the writing and the interviewing. So I think yes, but not something I would ever call my mom and let her know, like save that for a couple of years down the road.
And you became very familiar with all of the officials in town, I'm sure, and with CAL FIRE during that period.
Yeah, I did. Again, it's just every time I would come into town, I had a little loop that I would do where I would stop in and say hi to the local police chief and the local fire chief. I would go to the Starbucks and say hello to the baristas. There was one little Thai restaurant in town, which for a while was like the only restaurant that was open. So I would go there and order green curry and talk to him. And so I think it's just asking week after week, like, hey, how are the kids? Like, how are you feeling? How are people feeling? And it's just being committed to a place and to a story.
Mhm. Were you working on other stories at the same time? So Paradise wasn't the only story you had?
Yeah, I wish I had the luxury of having been able to take full book leave, but I learned pretty early on that if I tried to do that, I would lose my health insurance. And also you have to support yourself while you're writing a book. So I had to get a paycheck somehow, right? So I was also writing stories for the San Francisco Chronicle while I was reporting on the book. But I am really lucky in the fact that so much of what I wrote about for the paper really neatly intersected with the book. So I could sort of do both at the same time, right? Like I love learning things. So like, for example, I wrote this story for the paper about the identification efforts of all of these people who didn't survive the fire. And in some cases, all that was left was like, an artificial hip or a few fragments of bones, and how officials were going about identifying those people. So out of that story, there were maybe only a few lines or a paragraph or two that made it into the book. But, that was information I could sort of dip into and say, okay, that's a great detail. So I'm going to steal that for the book too. So it was double the work, but luckily it's not like they were totally disparate things. They were very related.
I think the one of the many things that comes out in the book is the impact of climate change. The drought, dead and diseased trees, the population increase, temperature increase. And did you intend that to be part of the story?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think the way that these fires have been acting for, the past several years, it's nothing that we've really experienced before in modern history, right? Like just the loss of life and the number of buildings burned and the intensity of fire behavior, like the temperatures that it's burning and how it's burning. And, climate change isn't the one cause, but it is something that fire scientists call a threat multiplier. So all of these things that were already on the landscape, everything from, like you said, dead and diseased trees to houses being really deep on flammable land to really vulnerable electrical infrastructure that hasn't been updated. It just like increases that threat. So the chances of a big disastrous fire happening are that much more. So I thought it was really important to get people to understand what climate change feels like, beyond the fact that, it's our new normal. You hear that so much. And I wanted to put a feeling to that. Like, what is the new normal? What does that feel like? What does it mean that this is just our normal at this point, right? Like it doesn't feel new anymore. It's just our reality and we have to figure out how we're going to tackle it.
I had a question from somebody that wants to know what started the fire.
Yeah, so the campfire started back near this tiny little ghost town called Polga. And on that land, there was this Pacific Gas and Electric Company transmission tower, which is, high voltage power lines that carry electricity really long distances. And one of those lines was held up by this one hook, and it had been wearing in the wind for almost 100 years. And on that morning, it snapped, the electrical line fell, and, sprayed molten metal into the grass. And that's what started the fire. And, the prevention really could have been very easy. The replacement cost of the hook alone was only $19. So if PG&E had been properly doing inspections and realized that that hook was really fragile, it could have sent someone up there to swap it out for a new one. And maybe that fire could have been prevented.
And somebody else asked, how do we know that? How do we know it was that one hook?
Yeah, so CAL FIRE has a very sophisticated arm of investigators. So anytime a fire happens, they send them out to go investigate and see how it started, right? These are guys and gals who are trained to figure out if, it was a trailer scraping against the cement. In one case, the Mendocino complex a few years ago was sparked by a guy plugging a wasp nest in the ground. And so when the campfire started, it was only a few hours after the fact, and they hiked up to that line. You kind of trace the fire backwards and realize, okay, well, it's somewhere within this acre. And the evidence was right there. There was this big black flash mark on the tower. They noticed that the line had fallen, that the tower wasn't symmetrical anymore, that one piece of it was kind of askew. And so from there, they did metallurgical testing, sent the hook over to Quantico, Virginia, where the FBI lab studied it. And it's a really long, extensive investigation. And I think it was several months before the report actually came out saying, okay, this is how it started. And this is why we know. And his reports are very thick. It's not like it's a one paragraph report. So they put a lot of time into giving people answers, because sometimes that's all they have. When you've lost everything, you want to know why.
You mentioned in your book that you trained as a firefighter. Could you talk a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, I think that's probably the farthest my curiosity has ever pushed me. So I really wanted to understand firefighting and how you put a fire out, how fire behavior works, and how the minds of firefighters work. So there was a county in the Bay Area, and I reached out to them, and they had offered to let me go through their professional firefighting academy. And it's 2 weeks. The first week was structural firefighting, which is, when you're going into buildings and putting out house fires. And then the second half of it was wildland firefighting. So they literally set a field on fire, and we had to go put it out with rigs and hoses and hose line. I was one of 3 women in a class of 50, and all of my gear was about 2 sizes too big because they were giving me loaners. And they had also asked that I not mention to the other kids in my class that I wasn't actually going to become a firefighter, because they didn't want me to be a distraction. But I think those entire 2 weeks, everyone was like, what is she doing here? Because, I was definitely the worst person or I at least thought I was the worst person in the class, because all of these guys and gals had been training and taking classes and knew which way to crank open the fire hydrant. And, at one point they put you in this box filled with wires, and you're in your full turnout gear, and you have to writhe around and get out of the box. And it simulates being in a trapped attic. And every one of those exercises, I feel like it took me twice as long, and it was really hard. And every day I would go home and be like, I don't want to go back tomorrow. I can't do it again. But, I did learn a lot. And when I graduated, they were like, you actually did better than some of the kids in the class. So I take that as a mark of pride.
I had family who've been in several wildfires in California, most recently the Caldor. And I watched a lot of the images of the firefighters and listened to the press conferences or the briefings they had every evening and every morning. And those firefighters were out there for almost 12 hours and, intense heat, chopping down trees, creating trenches. It's an incredibly difficult job. We're so thankful that that they are there. So I think the interesting thing is I read that Governor Newsom in recent legislation actually approved a bill that would allow prescribed burns, and I gather before that it was not allowed. And clearly, that's one strategy that we can use to try to better manage fires rather than just letting everything burn. So
it's like that old saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of solution. And right. I think in this state it's more so shifting those resources towards being proactive instead of reacting to the fire. But things like preventative burning can be so hard because people don't want to see smoke in the sky in December. We're very fatigued by it, and there's nothing to always say that it'll go right, that it'll burn what it's supposed to burn. But it's one of the best tools in our toolbox, I think.
Right. How did you decide which stories to include in your book?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I ended up interviewing more than 500 people for this book, and there are a couple of them that sort of form the spine where you really intimately get to know them. There's a woman who had a baby via C-section about 12 hours before the fire started. Mm-hmm. There's this bus driver who had recently lost his father to cancer and realized that he had bigger dreams for himself than working at a Walgreens. So he decided to go back to school and was driving the school bus to provide for his family as he pursued his dream of becoming a teacher. And then this couple that outran the fire on their four-wheeler. And so in picking those people and focusing on those stories, I think a lot of it was just instinct, right? It's the people that I went to bed thinking about and woke up in the morning and I was still thinking about them. Those stories that really got under my skin or said something about, life and love and the sacrifices we make for each other, or these acts of bravery that you never expect to have to make when you're waking up on a Thursday morning at 8 a.m. And so I was like, okay, if I feel this way about their stories, like if I'm this touched, then I know other people will be too. And that's the best way you can humanize a disaster like a wildfire, where it starts to feel so huge and amorphous. And it's like, how do you even wrap your mind around that? The devil's in the detail. And so I feel like those people really just emphasized and illustrated how bad the fire was and the actions they had to take.
Yeah, I vividly recall the story about Kevin and the bus driver and the kids in the bus. And, it was, you really didn't know what was going to happen. It was really spellbinding. And I assume you talked with Kevin and interviewed him.
Oh yeah, I spent a lot of time with Kevin. He was kind enough to drive me around in the bus after the fire, and bus full of high schoolers. I didn't mention to him that I got car sick really easily as we're like rattling around Butte County for 8 hours. And I'm like, oh, I wish I had taken some motion sickness medication. But yeah, I mean, you really get to know these people when you're writing about them in this deep amount of detail and you start to care about them.
Do you think that the firefighters are learning how to fight these fires more effectively today?
I think that wildland firefighting in California has sort of relied on the same skills and techniques for putting out these fires as they have for like 100 years. And the thing to remember is that at a certain point, if a fire is really extreme, you can't put it out.
Right.
As one man told me, he was like, look, you can fight fire, but you can't fight weather. The wind is blowing at 100 miles per hour and pushing the flames. Like there's literally nothing you can do. And so, I don't know if they're learning to fight it better. I think they're trying to learn to use technology to understand where the fire is at and keep people safe. But I think the real lesson is learning to be more proactive in terms of how to prevent fire, right? Like we're finally really seeing the importance of that.
Right. Would you read a passage from the book?
Yeah. So I picked this passage because I feel like it really spoke to why people picked Paradise and, why it was such a unique town that people really fell in love with. People were drawn to the hamlet because it was affordable, or because it was a little out of the way, or because it had small town charm. It was the kind of place that lined the skyway with more than 1,000 full-sized American flags on Memorial Day and allowed a 99-year-old to compete for the title of Chocolate Queen at the annual Chocolate Fest. The kind of place that celebrated holidays like Johnny Appleseed Day, when volunteers baked 1,000 pies to sell for $15 each in Terriash Park, and an actor dressed up as Johnny, wearing a silver bucket atop his head and toting a wicker basket brimming with apples. In April, everyone looked forward to the weekend of Gold Nugget Days, when children competed in the costume contest and teenagers vied for the Miss Gold Nugget crown. Families cheered at the Donkey Derby and lined lawn chairs along the side of the road to view the parade. parents rubbing sunscreen onto their children's wriggling bodies as they waited for it to depart from the holiday market shopping center.
Yeah, that's very, very effective. And reflective of the book as well. What happened to the people since you've interviewed them? Have you kept track of that?
Yeah. I always joke that my job feels like part untrained therapist, part researcher, and part social worker, where you really have to keep track of people and what's happening in their lives. And, even after I'd finished reporting on the book, I was still really invested and cared about their lives. So we've kept in touch. So the mother who had the baby via C-section, her little boy is going to be 3 years old this November, which is just, I think, mind-boggling, because he is like such a physical representation of how much time has passed since that fire. So she sent me a video the other day, and he was blowing kisses and saying hello. And, I remember him when he was just like a big Chipotle burrito size, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then a couple of folks have moved away from their homes, people who thought they would stay in paradise and try and help it rebuild. They've realized that the trauma just lingers and that they don't want to live in that anymore. So the town manager moved away. Some of the teachers moved away. Even if their homes have survived, they've realized that they just can't continue to show up in that way anymore, that they have to take care of themselves too. And then I think as well, just, people are trying to rebuild their lives in ways that feel appropriate. So some people have moved as far away as Idaho. But I think the most exciting development is Kevin, who is the bus driver. He graduated from Chico State in May and is student teaching this semester. So he'll have his teaching certification soon. And then he will have finally achieved his dreams of becoming a teacher.
Oh,
So
that's a remarkable story.
Probably the happiest story to come out of it. Yeah, he's a really great guy.
Yeah, as I said, that bus ride with the kids was just incredible. You were sitting on the end of the seat to try to see to learn what happened. So one of the real critical pieces in the book was about the planning in the city, or the lack of the planning in the city, and the size of the roads and the egresses. And it was just incredible that people couldn't get out of town, and nobody had thought about that ahead of time. And could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Great questions, by the way, Karen. So Paradise was built before land use planning was really even a thought. So for those of you that aren't familiar with the place, it's sort of up on this plateau. So if Chico is down on the valley floor, you have to drive up on the skyway into Paradise, and it takes maybe 20, 25 minutes. And so just because of the way it's situated in between these two big canyons, there was only 4 ways out to the south and 1 way out to the north. And the route out to the north wasn't even direct. It sort of looped and went around for an hour before you really caught anywhere. And so the big issue was that as the town grew, everything sort of got cemented in place, and there were only a few ways out. And so town managers knew this, town planners knew this, and they didn't really do anything about it, just because they had this big question in their minds, right? Where it's like, okay, if you're a poor rural community and you have $20 to spend, are you going to spend that $20 on fixing the roads and the evacuation routes for a fire that might only happen once every 100 years? Or are you going to use that to, make the roads safer, even if it makes them more dangerous in the long term? So you can't totally fault these local planners, because they were doing the best with what they had, but they didn't fully realize how great the crisis was. There had been so many reports warning that a fire like this would happen in Paradise at some point, but I think because of the way climate change accelerates things, again, no one quite fully understood how great the risk was. And I think part of that is just learning to survive from the day to day. I always make the comparison that it's not dissimilar to living in San Francisco or in the Bay Area, knowing that the next big earthquake could happen at any moment.
Right.
Like if you wake up every morning thinking about that, that's terrifying. You'll never be able to do anything. So you sort of minimize it and you're like, oh no, it won't happen today. Like it won't happen next year. Like when it happens, I'll be fine. And that's really problematic thinking. So when the fire happened, when it swept over Paradise, there were just way too many cars trying to get out of town and everyone got stuck. And 85 people ended up dying because the evacuation alerts were really fragmented and scattered, and cars ended up blocking the road so people couldn't get through, and it was just a mess. Like,
yeah, one of the things that struck me was the total lack of coordination in the town and notifying residents about when to escape, and nobody really having the authority to say, now is the time, get out. And
right. And that's not dissimilar to what we've seen in other fires across the state too. I think that, we've kind of had our heads in the sand for the past decade in terms of realizing that, again, this is our reality now, and these big fires are going to keep happening. And so we have to have a really strong plan to help people make decisions about when to leave their homes. We saw this during the Tubbs fire in Sonoma County, where emergency planners decided not to use code or the Amber Alert system and instead dispatched a code red style text message alert. And I think only 2% of people got them. And so it was the same thing up in Paradise where, as the fire approached town, those in town hall were trying to figure out when to send the alerts, but they were overwhelmed and scared and they weren't getting good information. And so they stalled. And by the time they opted to do that, the cell towers were failing. So again, people just weren't getting the information that they needed to make a huge decision, which is, do you stay or do you go? Do you leave your home knowing that it might burn down and you'll lose everything? And you just get in the car and go? Like, that's a really tough spot to be in.
yeah, somebody commented that this was a real eye opener with the people supposedly in control, not knowing what was happening with the fire.
Mm-hmm. And that stretched up the entire chain of command where, even the firefighters who were on the scene couldn't get good eyes on the fire because it was just moving too fast and the smoke was totally covering it. So, at one point, by the time they were talking about evacuating Concow, the fire was already on the outskirts of Paradise, but no one knew and no one could see it.
Right. I know with the CCU and with the Caldor, I had relatives who were evacuated and they were, I think, given quite a bit of notice, to leave. Well, not Caldor, they had to leave pretty quickly, but CCU, they had a little bit longer time to leave. But even when somebody says you need to leave now, you really panic and you just get in the car and you go, and you don't think about it. Although I have read stories about the CCU, which was down in Santa Cruz, of people who stayed and refused to evacuate, and some of them died. So really tragic stories.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that those evacuations, that the information went out a little earlier. But again, it's hard to really put yourself in that spot until it's happening. Even a couple of months ago, the building that I lived in San Francisco, someone pulled the fire alarm at 3 a.m. and I just left my apartment in my pajamas and was shivering on the sidewalk. And I was like, I cover fires, and I didn't grab a coat or things that I might need. So good information helps. And I think part of being informed is realizing that you need to have a plan, because you can be all high and mighty and think that you'll know exactly what to do in that moment, but
No,
likely you won't. Yeah.
Somebody asked about how did the citizens of Paradise feel about the president's visit?
Butte County, which is where Paradise is, has always been more of a purple county. So there were people that were very offended by his visit, particularly because there were a couple of instances where he forgot the town's name. Instead of calling it Paradise, he called it Pleasure, and people had to correct him. But there were also people who were big supporters of him and saw it as a sign of support, saw it that he was reaching out and showing to them that he was going to support them during the efforts. You have to remember that it was around this time when he was making threats to withhold federal funding to fire prone areas, saying, California should have this figured out. Like, it's the West's fault. And to some people, his presence was a comfort of like, okay, actually, he's going to give us this money. So it's pretty split, not dissimilar to what you see nationally in terms of support and hatred of him.
And were you there when he came through?
I was like, I'm going to take that day off. So I was back in San Francisco that day, sleeping in, and I was like, you know what, I've covered enough tragic things. I think I can step back and let someone else go cover the president.
When you did interviews of the people in Paradise, were you writing longhand? You were taking notes? How do you do the process to create your book and report?
Yeah. It depends where the interview takes place, but if I was out, walking around with someone, I always have my audio recorder going to make sure that I don't miss anything. It's a great way to accuracy check later too, against my notes. And you always have to be prepared in case something goes wrong. So I also am writing in my notebook the entire time in case the recording fails. I don't want to be in a situation where I have nothing to show for it. More often, when I go back and I'm doing immersive reporting after the fact, I'll go sit down in someone's home. And in that case, I'll have my laptop open and I'll be typing notes the entire time while also having the tape recorder going. I would say one of my best skills, and isn't very helpful for most things in life, but I do type very fast. So if I ever lose my job, hopefully I can go be a court reporter and type out court transcripts. So that's how I do it.
Yeah, I noticed in my dealings with reporters when I was working, I noticed that a lot typed really fast, and so I think that's a good skill to have. So do you think that there is any improvement in the coordination between agencies? Because in these fires, there's so many different agencies that are part of it. And, somebody has to be in charge and everybody has to work together. And, one hopes that there is an improvement in how the fires are coordinated. What's your view of that?
Yeah, I think it's getting better across the state. I do know that locally in Butte County, there were a lot of after action reports that came out, which basically studied the fire and tried to figure out where things went wrong. And, one big thing that happened in Butte County is they realized that they weren't doing evacuation alerts the way that they should. So they took away that power from local governments like Paradise. And now it's just the sheriff's office that sends out the evacuation alerts. For those of you that haven't finished reading the book yet, like that was a big issue during the campfire, and that it was very unclear who was supposed to be sending the alerts. So the town of Paradise was sending them out, but also the Butte County Sheriff's Office was sending them out, and they weren't coordinating, and the messages were saying very different things, but going to the same groups of people and causing additional confusion. So they've made a big push to clear that up.
Somebody asked about how did the Santa Rosa fire affect the response in Paradise?
I don't remember there being a fire in Santa Rosa at the time of the campfire, but that day there was a fire in Southern California that started called the Woolsey Fire. And it ended up becoming a very destructive fire in terms of state statistics as well. And so that was a big issue where they had two huge fires on both ends of the state, and they were drawing resources away from each other. So, they were throwing a ton of firefighters at them, but they had to share.
Do you see any improvement in state regulations on building in fire-prone areas?
This isn't something I've followed as closely in the past year since I wrapped up the manuscript, but California does have better fire standards for homes than pretty much any other state. It was passed in 2008, I believe, and mandated the addition of attic screenings and vents and things like that to help homes become more fire safe. And I think there are talks now of, okay, well, now that we've done this, what can we do even better? It's much easier to tackle those things at a local level. And so in Paradise, the local leaders have tried really hard to make the town safer and saying like, okay, well, if you have a wooden fence, you can't just attach it to your house. You have to like separate it by metal or something else. So those conversations are happening, and trying to make our home safer.
Yeah, yeah. Certainly, there's also better understanding about the health consequences of smoke and better monitoring of the air quality during these fires. I know up in the Caldor fire, we were watching the air quality and it was up to 400 and 500. And they were still letting people come in and reoccupy the housing. But, the quality of the air was just incredible. So it's.
Yeah. I feel like a few years ago, no one knew what AQI was. And now everyone knows how to monitor it, and about purple versus red. And
right. Yeah. And now everybody knows what it is. One of the issues that, and we've kind of talked about it a little bit, was the confluence of issues that led to the devastation. It's not just the quality, the lack of controlled burn, the city planning, the lack of coordination among agencies seems to be part of the whole fire issue. It wasn't just one thing. I mean, we know that PG&E actually caused it, but there were a lot of other factors that contributed to the devastation of the fire. And I think that's true in other fires as well.
Yeah, it's never just one thing. It can be very easy to want to have one simple solution for it, right? Like, oh, PG&E caused the fire and it's their fault. But what a lot of officials told me is, okay, well, even if it wasn't that transmission tower on that morning, it likely would have been something at some point. And I think we've really seen that in the past few years where, last summer we had the North Complex fire up in Butte County, right outside of Paradise again, and that was started by dry lightning. And then again, we had the Dixie fire this summer, again, right on the outskirts of Paradise, leveled a town. So, it's just, we're living with a century's worth of misinformed decision-making. Everything from how we approach fire. For a long time, it was viewed as this really evil thing that had to be stomped out of the environment. And white settlers who exterminated native populations didn't realize that fire was a really healthy part of the environment. And so without fire, the forest became more and more overgrown and diseased. And then, we weren't thinking about how we were developing the land. So we started sticking homes back in those snarled parts of the forest. And then climate change started making things drier and hotter. It extended the fire season to the point where in a lot of the state, all you need is a spark for a really awful fire to happen. So, that could come from a transmission tower, but if it wasn't that tower on that day, again, it would have been something else.
Right. Somebody asked, how did you find those stories?
Yeah, I think your job as a reporter is to lift up every stone and look and see what's underneath them, and to try and talk to as many people as you possibly can. Keep in mind that Paradise was a town of 26,500 people, and that's 26,500 stories right there, not to mention all of the people that lived in the surrounding communities, Concow, Magalia, Chico, Warville, places that were inundated and overflowed by people who were fleeing the fire and whose lives also changed because their populations in those cities doubled overnight. And so I think, again, it's just being there and talking to a lot of people and being curious and being interested. And, I end every conversation by saying, are there any questions that you wish that I would have asked you and I didn't? Like, what am I missing? Who should I talk to next? And so you sort of go down rabbit holes because someone will say, I actually heard of this woman who had a baby right before the fire. You should talk to her, and like, here's her friend's information, and maybe she can connect you to her. And that's sort of how it goes. Just asking a lot of questions, and again, listening to your instinct, right? Where you'll hear a story and you'll be like, oh, that's the story. Like, I really want to talk to that person.
It's kind of what you learn in journalist school.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And just, I think, a good sense of nosiness.
Yeah. Somebody asked about the stories of Native people and how did you uncover those? And those are fascinating.
Yeah, it's just so tragic in that those are stories that we don't see in our history books so often because it's just totally whitewashed, right? So after the fire, I just spent a lot of time trying to go out with people and to understand how the fire moved. And so as part of that, I was going out with the Butte County Fire Safe Council. The president would take politicians and local people out to show them the devastation because she hoped that, they would be affected and have change in some meaningful way. And so I was on that tour with them and met a couple who were members of the Concow tribe. And we were standing on this ledge overlooking the community of Concow, which had gotten totally blasted by the fire. And they told this story about a community that lived in Concow, and the fire blasted through and killed everyone except for one couple. And I just stood there and had goosebumps because it was like an echo of everything we had seen in the past few months. And it was that unique prehistory that, again, we just don't get to hear very often. And I knew that that was a really big piece of it too, right? Understanding people who had shepherded that land and called it home for so long, and understanding what they knew and how they saw fire as well.
You've moved to the East Coast now. If you were still here, would you be following other fires that are developing in California?
It's hard to say. I really enjoyed fire coverage. I feel like there was a lot of meaning in it in terms of getting people to care about something that I think we all sort of become numbed out to at a certain point across the state. It's hard to pay attention when there's so much destruction and devastation. And I felt like it was really significant to bring those stories to people. But at the same time, it's hard, even as a journalist, to bear witness to that, summer after summer, fire season after fire season, and especially when it feels like nothing is really changing. So I think I had hit a point where I was ready for a change, and that just coincided with an opportunity at the Washington Post, which took me to DC. It's the newsroom I'm working in now. I think that if I'd stayed in California, I probably would have transitioned to covering something else. But it's hard to know if that actually would have happened, because it would have been hard to pull myself away from covering those fires, because I felt like it was something that I could really do to try and help. And so maybe the only way to stop was just for me to move across the entire country. So I'm not totally sure, but it's been nice to cover non-fire related things this summer.
Did you have trouble getting your book sold?
I think there was a lot of interest, so I didn't really have that issue. I was actually very hesitant at first about whether to write it or not. Just because, by taking on a project like that, it's something that you're choosing to live with for 2 or 3 years.
Right.
And I was like, oh man, do I want to think about this fire every single day for 2 or 3 years? Like, what kind of weight is that to carry? But then again, there was so much meaning in it that I was like, I can't not write this book. So, and I think there was this thirst for people to understand what had happened, because there were so many disparate events and it was hard to really wrap your arms around it. And so I was like, okay, I can figure out what the meaning in this is and piece together what went wrong and how it happened. And maybe that could be something that helps a lot of people heal, and a lot of other people just understand and have compassion for what that place went through.
Right. Do you know if the book is selling well?
I don't look at those numbers.
Outside of California.
Yeah. I think have like a little bit of an obsessive personality where that serves me really well in reporting, where I'm very detail oriented and want to know everything. But I think maybe this is something that is better that I don't look at. So I haven't really been looking at the figures. Um, what matters to me more is that people are enjoying it and feel touched by it, and um, that the people in the book feel honored by it. So I hope it's selling well, but I think it's best if I don't look.
Well, you might know from the royalties, although I don't know how often you get royalty checks. So
I have no idea, but none have come. So I think that's something that takes a while to happen. And you see those like tweets from authors where they get the royalty check and it's like 13 cents, right? Like it's not why we do it. It's not something that like, you know, makes you well off enough to buy organic bananas at Whole Foods, but
who took the cover photo?
It was my friend Josh Edelson. He works at a Wire, and there are a couple of photographers that he works with, and they cover these fires every summer. And yeah, he snapped that photo. I have always wanted to know whose house that was right on the foreground and whether it survived or not, but not sure we'll ever know.
It's an incredible photo.
Can't take any credit for it, but Josh is an excellent photographer. So
yeah. What are you working on at the Washington Post now?
Yeah, I have a couple of projects that I'm working on. Nothing that has published yet, so I can't really say what it is at the moment, but there's stories that I really care about and I think will have meaning. I will say they're like just as depressing as wildfires. It's just like a new flavor of depressing. So maybe I'm not the writer that you want to read over your Sunday morning coffee. Maybe save it for like your Tuesday morning cry. But
I mean, a lot of authors say there's something inside where they have to write. Is that part of your makeup?
Writing sometimes feels like an exorcism where I'm like, oh, this story is inside of me and I like have to get it out. And sometimes it feels really easy and other times it's really painful. But like I said, it's just the meaning in it. I think it keeps me going. Our job is to shine light in dark places and to hold people and to hold their stories and to help everyone else understand and like what a gift that is to be able to do that. So I like the reporting more than I like the writing. I will say that. I talk to people all day.
Did any of the people in Paradise not want you to tell their story?
There are only a couple of people who didn't want to talk. And I think that was less about not wanting their story told and more about the fact that they had undergone a really traumatic thing. And sometimes it can be really scary to think about recounting that to a stranger, especially if it's a story that you haven't even told your loved ones. And so I totally get that. As a journalist, I never want to tell the story of someone who doesn't want their story to be told. And I always explain that when I talk to people and ask them to speak with me, where I say, I'm going to ask you a lot of nosy questions and I need you to be okay with that. And if there's any part of you that doesn't want to do it, then that's fine. Like, I would just rather know now. I don't want to feel like I need to like fool you into doing this interview. But for the most part, everyone in town had a story to tell. And I think for them, it was really cathartic to have someone to listen to them where, they didn't have to weigh what they were saying. Think about something awful that's happened to you and you have to like tell your family and friends about it. There's some piece of you that feels like you need to be comforting them as they're hearing about this hard thing that happened to you. And so I come in as a blank slate and just really listen and, they don't need to do anything for me. And I think, there is some way of healing from that and being able to own your experience and share it and have someone really listen.
One of our people who manages the or helps with these talks noted that it's interesting that our next author wrote Vera a story about the 1906 earthquake. So for those of you that like disaster stories, please stay tuned for our next event. So is there anything else that you want to tell us about the story, and something that I haven't asked or the viewers haven't asked?
Now you're speaking like a real reporter, Karen. I think it's just these fires in the state, like it's just the legacy that we're living with, and we have to start taking them seriously, because Paradise isn't the only town to burn down. Like we've already had places burn down this summer, and it's going to keep happening. And we can't just assume that climate change is this thing on the horizon that we don't have to deal with anymore, because it's here and it's our reality. And there are ways of protecting people and keeping them safer. So if that's the only thing you get from this book, then that's a good thing, right? Like remember Paradise and understand that it could have been so different that day.
Right. I just talked to somebody this afternoon who lost the house in the Grizzly Flats fire. It's so devastating. Somebody asked about, what does taking them seriously look like?
I think for a lot of people, particularly those who live in the wild and urban interface, which is those areas that are more fire prone, it's having a plan, having a go bag, knowing what your evacuation route would be, what hotel you're going to meet your family at. And, for people who don't live in the WUI, as they call it, there is power in terms of who you vote for and what issues you believe in and where you put your money. And just, I think, carrying that consciousness through your everyday life. And even just having conversations about it and being on the same page and thinking about it and educating yourself. Those are all steps in the right direction.
Well, I really want to thank you, Lizzie. It's an incredible story, and I think it's a story that everybody needs to read, particularly in California and the wildfire prone areas, because you never know what's going to happen, and you need to be prepared. And as you know, people think, well, that's never going to happen to me, but it does. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from your book, and I hope that federal agencies and local communities and individuals are taking this very seriously. So thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
It was a great talk. So
I agree.
Okay, and good luck in your future ventures at the Washington Post, but we miss you in California.
Thank you. All right, have a good night.
You too. So thank you to our viewers for joining us for this remarkable story of the campfire and Lizzie Johnson's extensive reporting of it. I encourage all of our viewers to read the gripping account of the campfire. And a reminder that copies can be purchased at Alameda's Book Inc. We have terrific upcoming Friends at Home programs in October. On the 27th, join us for a docent talk, Color into Line, a discussion of pastel collections, primarily from the Bay Area, covering works from the Renaissance to today. The exhibit opens at the Legion of Honor on October 9th. To end the month, mark your calendars for the Alameda Books Inc. sale on November 1st from 5 to 9 p.m. The Friends of the Alameda Free Library will receive 1% of all proceeds for book sales. So shop for holiday gifts for yourself and family, and or donate to the Alameda School Libraries. School librarian wish lists will be available for your purchases, and your selections will be delivered to the Alameda School Library of your choice. And on Wednesday, November 10th at 7 p.m., join us for American Abstraction at Mid-Century, a review of abstract art in New York following World War II, featuring large works of artists such as Jackson Pollock, William de Kooning, Joan Mitchell, Franz Klein, Helen Frankenthaler, Sam Gillian, and others. And please sign up for our mailings to receive advance notice about future events, and be sure to invite your friends to join us. A special recognition to our production team, David Beal, Karen Manuel, Karen Romer, Billy Reinschmidt, and Becky Sear. please consider a donation to Friends of the Alameda Free Library at alamedafriends.com or find the link in our chat. Watch our website, newsletter, weekly reminders, and Facebook page for additional events and to register. Finally, thanks to you, our audience, for joining us. Good night.